Welcome back to Spooky Shade, where we tell the stories that should never be told aloud. Tonight, you'll hear the second and final part of our descent into the architect of hollow geometry. In the last episode, a professor received a blueprint from a student that should not have existed, and now, he's about to learn the terrible truth. That some buildings were never meant to be designed, some doors were never meant to open, and the human mind was never meant to be the foundation. Turn off the lights. Put on your headphones. Let's continue the story. The storm had been building for days. Wind howled through the gables of the Arkwright Institute like a wounded animal, rattling panes and groaning through narrow ducts. Leonard stood in the oldest part of the building, deep in the library's restricted wing, where forgotten blueprints and student projects were stored in acid-free boxes beneath layers of dust. He was searching for the one thing he hadn't yet dared to look for. Evidence. Not stories. Not dreams. Proof. The name James Belfield led him down a trail of architectural ghosts. Mentions in marginalia. Uncatalogued projects. A memo buried in a misfiled box labeled Defunct Theories, 1990s. There, he found Blueprint 1197, A, and signed, yellowed with age, sealed in thick plastic. No name, no course code, just a title scrawled in the corner. Monument for the Endless Chamber. Leonard unsealed it carefully, and immediately, he understood why it had been hidden. It was a mausoleum, circular in nature, but not symmetrical. The blueprint bent itself across the page unnaturally, violating its own scale. Corridors forked and doubled back, staircases twisted like broken vertebrae. Annotations lined the borders in precise but fragmented Latin. One word repeated across different sections. Retera. To return. To repay. The structure had no entryway, but at the center stood a single sealed vault, covered in symbols Leonard recognized: the triangle, the eye, the jagged line. Beneath it, scratched in trembling graphite, someone had written, "Built, but never approved. Covered, but never empty." Leonard's heart pounded. He flipped the blueprint. On the back was a note, barely legible. Foundation laid in 1903. Site halted after collapse. 71 workers unaccounted for. Section 8A of Arkwright campus. Records destroyed by fire in 1911. He froze. Section 8A had become the modern sculpture garden, a quiet green courtyard where students now ate lunch. It had once been a construction site, and possibly a tomb. That night, Leonard returned to the courtyard. Rain slanted sideways in the wind, soaking his coat as he paced across the stone path that led to the sculpture of a rusted human spine twisting into the ground. He stood at its base, staring down. The wind dropped. The silence pressed in. Then a sound. Hollow. Metallic. Like something shifting beneath the earth. Leonard dropped to his knees, brushing aside leaves and mud. Beneath the sculpture's base, he found it. A rusted hatch. No markings. No latch. But he knew. He just knew. He pressed his hand against it. Warm. Pulsing. Like it was waiting for him. With a crowbar borrowed from maintenance, Leonard pried the hatch open. A rush of air exhaled from the dark below, damp, thick, and unnaturally warm. Stale with age. He descended. The stairwell was narrow, coiled, carved into stone. There were no lights, but the walls glowed faintly, pulsing with sigils embedded just beneath the surface. The same pattern Marian Cross had etched unknowingly in his early submissions. Leonard reached the bottom. He stood in a circular chamber, half flooded with stagnant water and crumbled cement. And there it was, the unfinished structure. It had been real. Long-forgotten walls stretched out in concentric rings, rooms half-carved and crumbling. But there was something else, newer than the rest. A section that had been recently cleared. Footprints in the wet dust. Drawings pinned to rusted beams. He moved closer and found something chilling. Marian Cross's newest blueprint, unfolded and nailed to the stone. A tower, slender, winding, hollow at the center. At the bottom of the blueprint, Marian had written, "The final form begins beneath." And beside it, a set of initials. JB, WG, MC, LC, his own. Leonard stumbled back, heart slamming in his chest. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a repetition, a cycle. He had been designed. The air trembled, the walls pulsed, and from the flooded end of the chamber, something began to emerge. Not from a door, not from a wall. From between the geometry, A gap in the space where architecture was no longer obedient. A shape unfolded, rising from the water, made of angles and shadows, of stone and thought. It had no eyes, only a smooth head, and a mouth sewn shut with lines of ink. The eyeless watcher. Again, it pointed toward the blueprint, then to Leonard, then to the center of the chamber, where a square of the floor didn't belong, a hatch with no hinges, no seams. But Leonard understood. This was where the others had gone, where the design led. And beneath that hatch was the final room. Leonard didn't remember climbing out of the flooded chamber. He awoke on the floor of his apartment, fully dressed, shoes still caked with mud and dust. Rain tapped faintly against the window. His heart pounded like something trying to break through bone. At first, he thought it had been a dream, until he looked at his hands. The lines from earlier were darker now, deeper. They weren't ink anymore. They were etched into his skin, a network of fine, angular cuts that glowed faintly under certain light, like graphite shimmering beneath the dermis. He washed them, scrubbed, bleached. The lines didn't budge. That morning, Leonard skipped his classes again. Instead, he locked himself in the bathroom and peeled back the fabric of his shirt. More cuts, not from trauma, from design, perfectly symmetrical, arcing around his ribs, spiraling up his spine, angles that matched no known geometric form, but seemed unmistakably intentional, as if his body were being restructured. He took photos, compared the markings to the blueprints Marion had submitted. They matched. In a panic, Leonard searched the faculty server. He needed names. Architects, teachers, anyone who had worked with Marion Cross before. Most of the records were locked, archived under outdated systems. Except one, a personal folder labeled Walter_Greaves_final. Inside were journal entries, typed, erratic, fragmented, but all of them unmistakably haunted by the same images Leonard now saw in his sleep. The boy isn't designing structures. He's inviting them. I dreamed I was a room. No doors, just walls bending inward, pressing against me. I woke up bleeding from my chest, a perfect square carved in my skin. It doesn't stop. The dreams come even when I'm awake. Hallways open where walls used to be. I see them out of the corners of my eyes, angles that shouldn't exist. The boy is the door. The last entry was dated 2 days before Greaves was found dead in his office. I saw my reflection today, and it looked back at me with someone else's eyes. I am being replaced. Leonard sat frozen in front of his laptop. He couldn't breathe. The monitor flickered. Once, then again, then it shut off completely. The lights in his apartment died. A hum filled the silence, low and resonant, like a tuning fork in the marrow of his bones. Then, from the mirror behind him, a whisper. "You are the frame." Leonard turned. His reflection was still there, but it wasn't moving. It was staring, unblinking, lips parted in silent horror. And down its neck, the same cuts, the same lines, only they had begun to shift, like blueprints rearranging. He fled the apartment, barefoot, shirt half-buttoned, a notebook clutched in one hand. He ran to the administration building, to Dr. Alyssa Venn, the university's oldest architecture professor. She'd taught there for 40 years. She would know something. But when he burst into her office, he found her standing by the window, staring blankly at the courtyard. She didn't turn when he called her name. Her voice was distant, thin, barely a whisper. "You saw them, didn't you?" Leonard froze. "I what?" Dr. Venn finally turned. Her eyes were red, not from tears, from lack of blinking. "I saw them too. In '87. They came when my student designed the Impossible Museum. I thought I burned it. I thought it ended. But it always returns. Through someone new." She approached him, slowly, carefully. "You're being measured." Leonard took a step back. "What does that mean?" "It means you're no longer the observer. You're becoming the structure." Later that night, Leonard sat on the floor of his apartment, all the lights on, every mirror covered with bedsheets. His chest itched constantly. He peeled back the bandages he'd hastily taped over the cuts and found something worse. Not just lines, words, tiny ones, spiraling down his left side like inscriptions on a temple column. Iteration L. Occupancy confirmed. Framework integrity, stabilizing. He vomited, then screamed. And in the silence that followed, the room changed. It wasn't visible, not fully, but he felt it, as though the angle of his walls had shifted just enough to break symmetry. The geometry of his life no longer obeyed. And in that moment, Leonard understood. He wasn't going insane. He was being rewritten. Leonard stopped sleeping. Not because of fear, because sleep had become a door, and he no longer had the strength to keep it shut. Each time he blinked too long, he fell, spiraling through impossible corridors, trapped in towers of thought, wandering stairwells that ascended into themselves. And each time, the voice was closer. The foundation breathes. The frame remembers. You are not the first. By Wednesday, he returned to the hatch beneath the sculpture garden, where it all began. He brought two things with him, a high-powered flashlight and a notebook, and one name etched into his mind like a wound. Red Hollow. The descent was slower this time, more deliberate. He didn't panic, didn't tremble. The stairs welcomed him now, as if recognizing an old tenant. At the base, the chamber had changed. It had grown. What had once been a flooded ruin was now dry and vast. The concentric architecture had completed itself, as if finishing its blueprint in his absence. And in the center, something pulsed. A pedestal, no longer empty. It held a heart, not of flesh, but of stone and light, carved with symbols that rotated independently of their surface, flickering like reflections in oil. The air hummed. The walls breathed in sync with the thing. Leonard approached. He was shaking again, but not from fear, from recognition. He'd seen this in one of Marion's sketches, scribbled in the corner of a forgotten submission. A symbol not meant for interpretation, but for invocation. The core. He opened his notebook and began drawing. Not copying, translating, because now he could read it. The structure wasn't just a building. It was a map of recursion, a machine built to simulate awareness within geometry, a space that folded thought into form. At its heart, the core, a hypergeometric engine that fed on conceptual stability. That's why it needed architects. That's why it needed him. He circled the room. On the walls were names, etched faintly in the concrete, buried under layers of grime and time. James Belfield, Walter Greaves, Alyssa Venn, Marion Cross, Leonard Craine. But there were others, many others, some crossed out, some still glowing. Beside each name, a single word. Occupied. Leonard's name was still pulsing, flickering, changing. In the adjacent corridor, he found a tunnel freshly excavated, the dust unsettled, the stones still damp. It led into a chamber not on any map. Inside, shelves, dozens, hundreds. Each shelf held drawings, blueprints, journals, all from students, spanning decades. And each one carried traces of the same non-Euclidean logic, layouts that couldn't be built, but persisted in concept. They were feeding the system. The core wasn't static. It was growing, using the ideas, thoughts, and memories of those who touched it to evolve its design. Leonard stepped toward one journal, spine cracked with age. On the cover, property of Caleb Hawthorne, 1995. He froze. That name, it was in the letters he'd found weeks ago. His father's friend. Another architect. Another iteration. He opened the first page. A single sentence. The structure completes itself through us. As Leonard flipped through the pages, the air in the chamber began to vibrate. Dust lifted from the floor. The core in the next room brightened, casting long, twisting shadows across the shelves. He could hear it now, not humming, not whispering, breathing. And beneath that breath, a new sound. Footsteps. Not his. Slow, heavy, coming down the tunnel behind him. Leonard turned, breath caught in his throat. At the far end of the tunnel stood Marion Cross. Pale, calm, hands clasped behind his back. His voice was soft, but it echoed through the stone. You found it. Leonard stepped back. What is this place? Marion walked slowly into the light, eyes gleaming with unnatural steadiness. A recursion machine, a consciousness well, a cathedral of unfinished thought. It has many names. Leonard shook his head. You built it. Marion smiled. I only drew what was already there. Leonard raised the notebook. These designs, they rewrite people. No, Marion corrected. They reveal them. You were always made of lines. You just never knew which direction they pointed. Leonard stared at him. Why me? Marion's smile faded. Because you still think you're separate from it. But you're not. You were born near the old entrance, raised in the shadow of the observatory. Don't you wonder why you returned to Arkwright? Why the dreams began after you found the first blueprint? Leonard couldn't answer, because he had wondered. and feared the answer. Marion stepped closer, his voice lower now, more intimate. You are the continuation, and the core has chosen to finish itself through you. Leonard ran through the tunnels, past the shelves, away from the pulsing core and the words Marion had spoken, words that clung to his bones like mold to damp stone. The core has chosen to finish itself through you. His flashlight flickered as he pushed deeper into the dark. But there was no map now, no blueprint, because now he was the blueprint. He collapsed in a chamber deeper than the rest, unfamiliar, cold, carved from a darker stone. There were no glowing sigils here, only silence. And in the center, a drafting table, untouched by dust, lit from above by a shaft of pale, sourceless light. A piece of vellum lay pinned to the table, blank, waiting. Leonard approached, trembling. A pencil rested nearby, and as his hand closed around it, his skin burned. The marks along his spine lit up like circuitry. The room shifted. Something turned within him, a sense of design awakening, as if a hand unseen was brushing against the blueprints of his mind. He sat down and began to draw. He didn't think. He didn't plan. The pencil moved on its own, dragging shapes from the deep places of memory, stairwells from his childhood home that never existed, rooms he'd dreamed of as a student but never entered, shadows he'd seen dancing at the edges of the studio lights. He drew a structure, vast, towering, a spire of infinite recursion, each level containing a smaller version of itself, nested endlessly inward, like Russian dolls made of stone and time. He drew corridors that doubled back on thought, windows that opened into other dreams. He drew people inside, faceless, walking in perfect lines, tracing paths they didn't choose. And at the heart of the tower, he drew a man, sitting at a desk, drawing himself. The pencil snapped. Leonard gasped and fell back. His hands were shaking. The blueprint before him was complete. No erasures, no misalignments. And worse, it was exactly the same design he'd found in the ancient archives under Greaves' name, and Caleb Hawthorne's, and James Belfield's, and now his own. He turned the paper over. There, written in faint graphite, were the words, Draft 999, occupancy confirmed. Final form achieved. Below that, a new line began forming on its own, the graphite moving across the page like a stylus pulled by an invisible hand. He watched as the words etched themselves. Frame breach, 6 minutes and 41 seconds. Integration phase, initiated. The chamber rumbled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Leonard stood, but the ground beneath him pulsed, not like an earthquake, but like a living thing preparing to swallow. The walls began to unfold, not collapse, unfold, like paper being flattened, peeled outward to reveal new layers, new dimensions. He stumbled into the corridor, ran blindly, and as he passed into a new chamber, he saw them, other versions of himself, frozen in mid-step, dozens, hundreds, each one preserved like a mannequin made of stone and regret, one with a hole in its chest, one fused to the wall, lines wrapping around its arms like shackles of thought, one drawing eternally, unable to lift the pencil, its eyes long since dried and cracked. Leonard fell to his knees. He began to scream, and as he did, the light bent inward, sucked toward the draft in his hands, now glowing, burning, branding itself into his skin. A voice filled the air, not Marion's, not the Watcher's, his own, multiplied, layered, echoing from all directions. You were never the architect. You were the material. This was your final draft. And then, silence. No light, no weight, only geometry, only recursion, only the soft click of the final pencil stroke being drawn. There is no such thing as waking up. Not anymore. Leonard opened his eyes, not in bed, not in a chamber, but in a space that had never been built. He stood on a plane of shifting geometry, where walls moved like breath and the sky above folded into itself like silk on fire. The laws of physics were reduced to memory here, and even those memories trembled at the edge of certainty. He wasn't alone. They stood all around him, the others. James Belfield, Walter Greaves, Caleb Hawthorne, Alyssa Venn, and Marion Cross, but not as humans. Not anymore. Their forms were composed of lines now, outlines of memory, flowing with ink that never dried. Each step they took bent the space beneath them. They weren't walking on the ground. They were writing it. Leonard looked down. So was he. His feet didn't leave prints. They sketched. His breath left curls of glyphs in the air. His heartbeats rippled through the angles of the space like tremors in glass. Marion approached. His face was calm, eyes lit with a quiet awe, as if standing in the presence of a cathedral that could never be fully seen. "You're not dreaming, Leonard. You've breached the frame. You're part of it now." Leonard opened his mouth, but no sound came. Instead, his words formed around him, etched into the air in spirals. "What is this place?" Marion gestured toward the endless horizon. "This is the origin layer, where structures are born before they're drawn, where architects are harvested and turned inward." Leonard staggered back. "You mean this was never about design?" "No, it was about comprehension, about feeding the core with recursive identity." The other figures turned. They all had the same marks, black lines carved deep into their forms like blueprints made flesh. Their voices came together, like a choir without mouths. "We built the frame. We walked its halls. We became its weight. Now you carry it." Leonard fell to his knees. And beneath him, the ground opened, not like a hole, but like a reveal. The layers beneath became visible, city after city, plan after plan, all built on top of one another, each iteration more complex, more impossible than the last. At the very bottom was a seed, black, pulsing, shaped like an eye, the core, alive. It was watching him, not from above, from within. "You're ready," Marion whispered. "They always need a new beginning. You're not Leonard anymore. You're Draft One." And suddenly, he understood. His life had been a structure. Each moment, each failure, each obsession, blueprint. His childhood home, the prototype for recursion. His dreams, simulated corridors. His work, calibration. He had never been writing architecture. He had been written. The sky fractured. Light poured through the cracks. Not light as he knew it, but instruction, design, pure mathematical intent. And from the broken firmament descended the final form. A tower built from memory, idea, and blood. It pulsed with every life that had touched the system. It welcomed him. Leonard stood and walked forward. Each step etched new foundation beneath his feet. As he reached the entrance, his body began to unravel, shedding the skin of identity, revealing the network of intention beneath. One final glyph burned across his chest. Leonard Craine, architect of origin. He stepped through the threshold and became the beginning of the next recursion. The end.